My name is Hannah Ormshaw. I'm the Natural Resource Manager for the San Mateo County Parks Department. And this evening, we're going to be presenting some information on our forest health and fuel reduction projects for Huddart and Wunderlich County Park. Just in terms of some housekeeping for the webinar tonight, there's a chat function if you want to type in any questions you might have that come up through the presentation. We also have plenty of time at the end for question and answer, so you can either type questions into the chat at that time or raise your hand if you want to ask your question out loud, and we'll turn the mic over to you and happy to answer any questions you might have. If any folks attended any previous meetings that we've had on this topic, our presentation tonight will give a little bit of a summary of the same information, but we'll go into a bit more detail as well on the project implementation now that we're getting closer to the start date. And so with that, I'm just going to get the presentation up so we can present some of the slides we have. And then just share some more information with you all for this project. So as I introduced, this is for the forest health and fuel reduction projects planned for Huddart and Wunderlich County Park. So for the presentation, I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of background about the project, and then I'm going to hand it over to our project partners who are also panelists on this call as well, to give some more background about the project details and information on the project implementation as well. So our projects for Huddart and Wunderlich, the San Mateo County Parks Department is working in partnership with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District to implement this forest health and fuel reduction project in Huddart and Wunderlich parks. The county parks natural resource management staff had identified the need for these projects based on our observations in the parks of declining forest health, largely due to a lot of trees and oak woodland areas that have been affected by sudden oak deaths, and also understanding that the parks have fuel risks and fuel loads that pose a risk to the surrounding communities. And so with that, we began working with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District to pursue funding opportunities for the work. And so the San Mateo RCD was successful in being awarded a grant from CAL FIRE and the California Climate Investments Group to implement this project, and have been managing the project and will be leading the efforts to oversee the project throughout implementation. So the grant was awarded from the CAL FIRE's Forest Health Program. These grant funds aim to fund projects that focus on active restoration and forest management activities that promote forest resiliency, that mitigate climate change, and that also protect communities from wildfire risk. The projects and the grant program also really aims to fund projects which provide benefits on a landscape scale. So very much focusing on where you can see a regional benefit from this type of work. So much of the funding for this also comes from the California Climate Investments Group, which uses cap and trade dollars to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so go into how our project helps to meet these goals. So the images that you see here are a good representation of differences in forest conditions. So in the top image, this is more typical of what you see throughout the parks currently in terms of the forest structure and the vegetation density. You have a lot of trees and an intermix of understory shrub and understory vegetation throughout the forest stands. While the bottom image is a good representation of a forest where management activities have occurred in order to reduce the understory vegetation density. And this would be also representative of the conditions that you would see in some of the forested areas of the parks after the project. In terms of providing benefits from an ecosystem or habitat perspective, by reducing understory vegetation, there are actually numerous benefits from this standpoint. Our management actions are, in a sense, recreating a form of disturbance in the forest, which historically would have been accomplished by fire, weather, or grazing wildlife. But present day, because we have a lack of natural disturbance, these forests are more dense, and these ecosystems are often at their carrying capacity. So this management approach would help to trigger cycles of natural succession and regrowth to provide more availability of resources like soil nutrients, water, and sunlight that would allow the retained vegetation to grow. And would also trigger and result in changes in the overall forest structure. Other benefits of the work that we're actively addressing infestations of invasive species in the park, like broom, eucalyptus, and acacia. We're also working to reduce the effects of sudden oak death in the parks by removing dead trees that have been affected by this disease, and also by removing California bay trees, which are a vector for the ongoing spread of this plant disease. The project is also designed to retain desired habitat features and desired native diversity. The new openings in the understory can also provide good movement corridors for large mammals and good foraging habitat for a variety of species. Another large benefit for the projects are fuel reduction and modifying fire behavior in the event the fire should occur. So understory vegetation thinning provides a benefit from community safety and fuel reduction standpoint, in that this type of work would really be considered establishment of shaded fuel breaks throughout the park, where the understory vegetation density is reduced, but the mature trees in the upper canopy are left in place. In the event that a wildfire should occur, shaded fuel breaks would help to slow the spread of the fire, would create conditions that would reduce the likelihood that a fire would spread and reach the forest canopy, and would also allow for better access to these areas for emergency fire response and suppression to occur, which would further limit the spread of a wildfire. As I mentioned, historically fires have been a form of natural disturbance and an important part of forest ecology, and that there's a distinction between what we consider a good fire versus a damaging fire. And so in the instance, or in the image that you see on the left-hand side, this is the result of a low intensity fire where the understory vegetation has been consumed, but the fire stays out of the canopy. And in this instance, the forest can regenerate readily, and you would see fairly rapid understory regrowth after this. In the picture on the right-hand side, this is representative of a more high intensity or more damaging fire in which the tree canopies did burn. And this results in much higher tree mortality, and it takes much longer for forests to regenerate after this type of fire. Lastly, as I mentioned, a focus for this grant is climate resiliency and carbon storage benefits. And so while it may seem counterintuitive that removing trees would help improve carbon storage, this is actually true. So by conducting forest thinning or reducing competition for resources, as result, the retained trees now have more resources and more space available to grow larger. And so our project will retain the healthy mature trees and allow them to grow and mature more readily. As an example, a mature or old growth redwood can store nearly 3 times as much carbon as a typical second growth redwood. And although redwoods are significant in their carbon storage capacity, the same concept holds true for other trees. So a mature oak tree would store more carbon than a younger or smaller oak tree. For our particular project, it's been calculated that approximately 3,500 metric tons of carbon would be sequestered, which is about equivalent to the amount of carbon that 675 Americans produce in a year. In terms of what to expect in Huddart and Wunderlich in the coming months while the project is underway, there will be intermittent trail closures occurring throughout the parks while our crews are working in different locations, and this is for public safety and for the crew safety while their equipment is operating. And so with that, we'll have advisories posted to our website frequently to keep the public updated on when and where these trail closures will occur. It's our hope that the work can be phased in a way in which these closures will be minimized, and so we can keep portions of the park open for recreation throughout the project and close certain trails as needed for different periods of time. The project will be going on for a fairly long duration. David will speak a bit more about the timeline, but it's anticipated to take several months to complete the entirety of the project. There will be a visual change in how you're used to seeing the park from the different trails throughout Wunderlich and Huddart. And this is usually the most drastic the first season after the work is performed. If you're familiar with the work that was done at Huddart in 2019, it is not that much long after the work is performed that you start to see vegetation regrow and the understory start to green back up again. But you'll certainly notice a difference after the work is performed. And the equipments will create some noise when they're operating as well, but there'll be time of day and day of week restrictions on when that noise disturbance might be occurring as well. And so before I hand it over, I do just want to provide a couple of options for getting more notifications about the project. So aside from visiting our website, particularly the park websites for Huddart and Wunderlich, where advisories will be posted, we also have project information available on the County Parks and RCD websites. And these 2 links at the top for Wunderlich and Huddart Park are specific for signing up for email notifications from our communication staff. And they'll be able to distribute direct notices and updates if you sign up for those emails. And those links will also be posted to the website if you need to find those after the presentation as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Hi, like Hannah said, my name is David Cowman, and I'm a project manager for the San Mateo RCD and serving as the primary project manager for this project. So I'll be going into some of the project details and timeline, but since we've given this presentation before and you all have likely heard a lot of the basic info, I'll be going more in depth into some specific questions or concerns that we've received since the initial webinar. But to summarize, the project in total will cover 402.1 acres, and the treatment will primarily be composed of mechanical mastication on slopes averaging less than 30% to thin, dense tree stands or cover, as well as dead, dying, or diseased tree populations. Primarily, we'll be targeting trees less than 8 inches in diameter, as well as some larger trees that are currently dead or dying from disease. Next slide, please. So we use the term or the word treatment pretty frequently in this context and potentially haven't spent enough time explaining what exactly treatment means. We use the term treatment to refer to any type of method used for vegetation management. So treatment could mean mechanical, manual, biological, or chemical methods. For this project, the vast majority of the project will be treated using mechanical methods, which you can see in these two pictures shown. The photo on the left depicts a skid steer, which can be fixed with a masticating or mulching head. In this photo, it doesn't actually have a masticating or mulching head, but it's capable of having one. And then the photo on the right is an excavator with a masticating or mulching head attached. So both of these pieces of equipment will likely be used in the project. These machines do not dig out the roots of plants, but rather sever them just above the soil surface. So the ultimate goal of any sort of forest health or fuel reduction project is to mimic natural disturbance. So like Hannah said, in a natural system, that would be fire or herbivory. So these machines kind of try to replicate that process. And then we also frequently receive questions regarding herbicide usage. And while we do not plan to use chemical treatment for the majority of the project area, in locations where invasive species are a concern or we're seeing invasive species regrowth, herbicide will be a tool in our toolbox, since this can often be the most effective method for long-term control of invasives. And San Mateo County Parks uses a targeted only approach where herbicides are applied directly to the target species as a spot treatment, not a broadcast treatment. And Hannah can go into more detail about this if people wish. Next slide, please. And there's a bit of a lag on the slide changes. Yep, there it is. So the equipment depicted on the previous slide will produce conditions that are seen in this photo sequence, specifically the center photo. These photos were part of the Kings Mountain project. And they were included in the original webinar presentation, so you've likely seen them before. But now with kind of a visual of the machinery that we'll be using, it puts the photos into context a little bit more. So the photo on the left is pre-treatment activities. So you can see the density of the shrubs, the continuity of fuels both vertically and horizontally. And then the photo in the center is immediately following treatment activities. So after the masticators have gone through and shredded the vegetation on site. So we're not removing the vegetation, we're just kind of chipping it on site. And then the photo on the right is 1 year post-treatment. So you can see that a lot of the shrubs have begun to resprout and grow back. So resprouting and kind of prolific revegetation is common for a lot of the plant communities in this region following disturbance because over time they've adapted with disturbance. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, we've gone through pretty extensive environmental review for this project. To prepare the environmental compliance documents, we hired local foresters, Steve Otten and Shelby Chronic from Otten Resource Consulting. And Steve is a registered professional forester with decades of experience managing forests for large landowners, specifically in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So like I said, he's got decades of experience with projects like this. And then Steve will also be available for the panel portion of this presentation to answer specific questions regarding project specs and environmental protection measures. Additionally, we hired biological consultants to conduct rare plant surveys for species such as Kings Mountain manzanita and Anderson's manzanita, and have supplemented this with San Mateo County Park staff biologists, arborists, as well as RCD staff biologists and environmental professionals. And then wildlife surveys were performed prior to implementation and will be performed throughout implementation for species such as red-legged frogs, nesting birds, wood rat nests, and bats. All sensitive resources or nests will be flagged for avoidance before the project work in any given location, and then additionally as they're discovered, if they're discovered during project activities. And then there are additional avoidance and minimization measures that are built into the project specs regarding working near water courses, operating on steep slopes, and then other sensitive biological and cultural resources. And then finally, throughout the project, habitat features such as downed logs, standing dead trees, habitat trees, and then pockets of habitat structure will be retained strategically. Next slide, please. So this is a map of treatment areas for Huddart County Park. And again, you guys have all probably seen this before, but this is a good representation for our rationale for project layout. As I mentioned, treatments will occur on slopes averaging 30% or less. So they tend to be congregated around ridge tops and kind of the upper slopes. It's also important to note that since this project is a forest health project, there are treatment areas that are both adjacent to roads and infrastructure, as well as deeper into the forest. So not always what you would typically see for a fuel reduction focused project, but definitely achieving those goals. Next slide, please. This is a map of the treatment areas in Wunderlich County Park. And the exact progression of our project activities is yet to be determined. We're currently working with our contractors to come up with a game plan for how to efficiently and effectively get the work done. And project activity will also be based on, the timing will be based to minimize impacts on biological resources. So avoiding certain areas during nesting bird season and other considerations. Next slide, please. So here's a timeline of our project implementation and a few other things. We are currently nearing the end of the permitting process. We produced the environmental documentation and we'll be filing the notice of determination very shortly. In mid-May, we received contractor bids for the project and chose Mountain F Enterprises to be the primary contractor for the project. Mountain F Enterprises has extensive experience working on similar projects throughout the state, and we're excited to partner with them. They've got all the necessary resources and expertise and plenty of background in it. And we are currently in the contract signing phase of that process. We've also completed preliminary biological and botanical surveys for the project, and we'll be performing nesting bird and bat roost surveys, like I said, throughout the duration of the project during the appropriate seasons. For that, we decided to contract with Sequoia Ecological Consulting, which is a biological consulting firm who will help us supplement some of the surveys. Surveys will also be provided by San Mateo County Park staff and potentially RCD staff as well. And then for some of the harder to survey areas, such as areas with dense shrubs, they'll be treated outside of nesting bird season, kind of to avoid any impacts. And then we're hoping to begin project implementation around the second week of July until the conditions become too wet, hopefully, fingers crossed. We will then be performing work seasonally until the end of 2022. Next slide, please. So this is, again, a slide that you all have likely seen before, but I'm going to focus more on the during and the post-project phases. Pre-project has already been covered pretty extensively in our other presentations. However, during the project, various staff with the RCD, county parks, and our consultant forester will interface regularly with the contractor. We'll be able to verify that work is being done according to the scope, that best management practices are being followed, and that all sensitive resources are being avoided. It's important to set the stage early with our contractor, what our expectations are towards the beginning of the project. So we'll be on site pretty frequently working in tandem with them. Additionally, as I've mentioned, we'll be contracting with a biological consulting firm to supplement nesting bird and bat roost surveys during the appropriate seasons. And then after project completion, County Parks staff will be monitoring the project routinely to observe regrowth and determine long-term maintenance need. Certain species that regrow, like invasive French broom or other broom species, as well as non-native species that regrow rapidly, will need follow-up treatment quickly, while some slower growing species like native shrubs may not be of concern for up to 5 years. Next slide, please. And then we've also gotten various questions regarding how we'll be addressing fire safety throughout the project. And written into our project specifications are details about monitoring fire weather, as well as fire suppression capabilities that the contractors must have. So to summarize, contractors must have a sealed box of firefighting hand tools, a chainsaw, and felling tools. They must maintain initial attack capabilities. So this means they'll need a combination of a 500-gallon water tank, as well as slip-on pump units for trucks, or fire suppression capabilities built into their heavy machinery. So like foam retardant that comes out of their machinery. And I'm happy to go more into details onto exactly what these capabilities are, but it's pretty lengthy and detailed, so it might not be the best use of our time or of interest to everyone here. And then we're also mandating that contractors patrol treatment areas for ignition sources prior to working, patrol treatment areas for operations during fire weather conditions, monitor wind, temperature, and relative humidity 3 times daily. And then San Mateo RCD, County Parks, and CAL FIRE reserve the right to restrict operations during critical fire weather. We'll also be in close contact with local fire agencies as well during drier conditions. Next slide. And now I'd like to send it back to Hannah to open up the panel for questions. As I mentioned, we have Steve Otten with Otten Resource Consulting available to answer questions as well.
Thanks, David. And I also want to introduce Dan Krug, our county arborist, who's played a large role in the planning and the project development, and Sheena Sidhu, who's with the San Mateo RCD as well. And so we'll all be able to answer questions. And so with that, I see a few that have come up in the chat that we can address first, but if you would like to have the mic, you can raise your hand or add any extra questions to the chat as well. So the first question from Amy, where will the work begin in Wunderlich? For example, which trails will be closed at the beginning? David or Steve? Yeah,
I can answer that kind of to a cursory level. We're still in discussion with our contractor, but it's looking like operations will occur towards the top of Wunderlich, kind of off Highway 35. Conditions up there tend to be wetter during the later months, and we want to capitalize on the moist conditions while we can.
And another question from Amy as well, do we have any places where long-term results are evident? So I think that means, Amy, that you're wondering if there's an example of where similar work has been performed and how that looks after a few years have passed. Okay. Great, thanks, Amy. Yeah, I think if you're interested in seeing areas specifically in Huddart County Park, we had a shaded fuel break project along Kings Mountain Road that was implemented in 2019. So while only a couple of years ago, it is probably the most relevant example and most local example in terms of similar habitats and similar forest types. And that's a great place to see how it looks a few years after regrowth and regeneration of the understory vegetation, and what you start to see growing back after this type of work is performed. We have a question from Ronnie Eaton. Sequoia Audubon volunteers currently have Western bluebird nest boxes in Huddart and possibly Wunderlich. Will they be advised by survey staff of any boxes that may be needed to be removed or relocated? Ronnie, actually, it would be really great if we could touch base with you about locations if you have information on that, because we definitely want to be able to avoid impacts to that and identify if there are conflicts with where they're located and where we have treatment areas planned. So perhaps we can connect separately and be able to make sure we're aware of those locations. From Len Erickson, would this methodology work in a eucalyptus forest such as Quarry Park? So in fact, the Quarry Park Governor's Fuel Reduction Project, which also occurred in 2019, is a very similar approach for this type of treatment in which mechanical equipment was used to reduce understory vegetation or remove small diameter trees on slopes averaging 30 to 40% throughout the park. And so that is proven to have been effective for that type of forest stand as well. Differences we've seen there are that eucalyptus and other invasive species that are very prevalent already in that park have grown back fairly readily. And so we have been doing regular maintenance and follow-up work throughout that project area to be able to keep the regrowth of these invasive species at a minimum. Any additions for that? No.
I think it's eucalyptus is a little bit more of a challenge too, especially when we're talking about Quarry Park. Slope and terrain is a limiting factor, but of course, as Hannah was saying, the follow-up treatment is goes hand in hand with any kind of eucalyptus management.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So from Amy, some of the plants take a long time to come back. Do we have any data that goes out longer, example, like 10 years? So in terms of examples for our own projects, we have not been implementing projects on this scale, prior to 2019 or so. Much of our fuel reduction efforts were much smaller in scale, and so providing like a visual example in one of our parks is we don't have much in terms of longer term, but what I can say is, the types of vegetation that we do have present, as David mentioned, are all well adapted to this type of disturbance. Historically, if that was through grazing or drought or fire, they're all species that are adapted to resprouting and regrowth and reestablishment. And so what we're seeing in Huddart Park regrowing after the Kings Mountain Road project, we're seeing a lot of native manzanita regrowing where they were prevalent before, and they're very well established. Their roots were left intact in the project, and we're seeing those species grow back very well in those project areas. And so we anticipate that to continue for the long term as well.
And I can add a little bit to that, not necessarily data regarding this exact treatment like mechanical mastication or things like that, but it's scientifically pretty well documented that not all, but most of the habitat types in this area evolved with fire, and a lot of the different species compositions are dependent upon fire or other disturbance. I should clarify, not just fire, but other disturbances as well. Specifically towards like the upper ridge tops of the Santa Cruz Mountains that were historically dominated by hardwoods and oaks and things like that. In the absence of disturbance, we're actually losing a lot of those species compositions. So like I said, I can't speak exactly to the impacts of mechanical mastication, but disturbance in general is very well documented, especially in this area.
I just might add a little bit to this conversation that's happening, because it's sort of pointing at the next question from our anonymous attendee is what does a healthy forest look like? And in a lot of ways, it's healthy forest and what species occupy there are really about a point in time, and trying to assess what maybe that looks like. I think, working on another project and down in the San Luis Obispo area, and just looking at aerial photos from over 100 years, and you can see just the various states of vegetation occupation and how they've changed over time. Super interesting study out on the coast in Santa Cruz that talks about this naturally occurring pond with pollen records back. And I know this is a little bit long, but it's just important to recognize the melange and this molding clay environment that we're working in. Is, the Santa Cruz Mountains were predominantly occupied by red fir almost 32,000 years ago in the area of the north coast above Davenport, and about 23 to 24,000 years ago were pine species. And it wasn't until 12,000 years ago that we saw pollen from redwoods for at least that area. And then we kind of scale down and look in a smaller realm, and we start thinking about what our occupancy is. And it seems like, one of the most important things that we agree on is a level of diversity. So I totally understand what Amy is saying in regards to that. Is we feel that diversity is a real strength. And we know that when we change the occupation in the forest and we reduce a level of competition, sometimes I'll try not to take too much time, but I think this is important. When we think about how a forest grows, and Hannah really alluded to it, is that each acre of forest produces only so much wood per acre, or just based on the amount of available nutrients, sunlight, and water. Sort of similar in cropland. Each acre of broccoli, for instance, when you're driving down the Salinas Valley, there's only so much room to grow so much broccoli, and it's the same thing in the forest, right? And based on, it's almost like you can kind of see a block of wood, like a cubic block of wood out there, and it's getting sliced up, and it's getting distributed to a remaining stand, right? And if we have to slice smaller slices of that wood and spread it out to 200 or 300 trees per acre, then we're not really increasing the health and vigor. We're not distributing that available nutrients and sunlight probably well enough. And so when we reduce the understory and we change that dynamics of growth and we add that growth onto less stems per acre, it's kind of like being able to have a little bit more food or a little bit more sunlight or a little bit more addition to make that forest that much stronger and healthier. And then sort of this face of climate change that's out there. We know it's getting warmer, right? There's definitely drought out there right now. We're trying to give these stands as much help as we can give them to help kind of maintain a status that, like we say, what is forest health? Well, at this time, it's sort of what we all perceive it is when we walk out there, and knowing that there are some things that we can do to sort of add to their health. And so that's a little bit of the target. I'll stop talking now, but good enough.
Thank you so much, Dee. That's really great to clarify, because I know I just touched on that very briefly, but I think that adds a lot of really good information to that concept. So from Ronnie, we have what management is planned for extensive regrowth in the treatment areas. So like David mentioned, this will be variable depending on what types of species are present. Some plants would regrow very rapidly, and others would regrow at a slower rate. And so that will be built into our monitoring for the project in terms of doing visual assessments of the treatment areas afterwards, and trying and measure and observe the rate of regrowth. And if we're dealing with things like invasive species, we would want to be planning rapid efforts to control those before they get too established or spread into other areas. But other species that are slower growing might not need much in terms of retreatment or management for 5 years or more. And so our hope is to be able to phase treatment efforts or maintenance work in a way that we can treat pockets of it intermittently over time, and have less disruption to the park and to the habitats, and be able to maintain the project benefits in the long term. I think the question about healthy forest, Steve got to kind of speak to that one a little bit, but really we're just acknowledging that the forest conditions that we have present day are much different than historic forests, because we do have development and human presence in these environments, fire suppression, and just through our presence and our activities and our interactions with these landscapes, we're not seeing the same type of natural disturbance frequently occurring in these areas. So we don't have necessarily a reference target or a year, historical target, but we're just understanding that the ecological processes involved in natural disturbance and the benefits of triggering natural succession in the forest stands is really the goal we're trying to accomplish here. What are the fuel reduction efforts carried out by the county employees aside from these types of large scale machinery? County park staff does have some of this machinery, but we, in terms of our staff-led efforts for vegetation management, a lot of it's generally focused first on trail maintenance, trail brushing, hazard tree removals, and making sure that the vegetation conditions throughout the park provide safe and healthy opportunities for our park users to enjoy the parks. And so that's the first priority for a lot of our staff efforts. We do smaller scale fuel reduction efforts and tree removal in some of the park areas, and we also hire contractors to do other vegetation management when we need to rely on additional manpower and skilled individuals to be able to help out with additional fuel reduction. So what type of natural disturbance are there aside from fires? So historically, large grazing herds were common across the landscape, and with habitat fragmentation and urban development, we're seeing smaller populations of these types of large mammals throughout the region. So that is a form of natural disturbance. You also have natural disturbances in the form of pests and disease, drought, natural disasters, storm events. So any of those can count as a form of natural disturbance, in addition to fire, of course.
Yeah, I'll also add that kind of pre-European contact in this area, a term called gap phase succession was utilized for a lot of these older forests before they were cut down. And that involved more like singular trees falling, landslides, more discrete forms of disturbance. So this type of project is, we're trying to mimic kind of broader disturbance, so fire, low intensity fire. But there are other forms of disturbance that kind of characterize the habitat types and created heterogeneity on like a micro and macro scale.
So for eucalyptus forest, would the goal be to convert to a different type of tree? How could that change be done? It's highly dependent on the goals of the project, or what you want to see occur. So converting, a eucalyptus forest isn't always feasible, or the intent of the work, especially when we're talking about fuel reduction. Often we're not looking at removing all trees. We're looking at reducing fuel density and fuel loading, modifying the fuel types. There is a project area in Wunderlich where eucalyptus removal was the intent, in converting to oak woodland was the intent of the project. So we do have an example of that in one of our parks. And this, many of you on the call who are familiar with Wunderlich are likely familiar with this project, but did involve full removal of eucalyptus stands and replanting of native oak trees and oak woodland species. So it's definitely a concerted effort to try and make that transition, and a lot of ongoing restoration needs in terms of establishing the oak trees and the other native vegetation in order to replace that eucalyptus stand.
I think it might also be important to point out that kind of the amount and distribution and density of trees that we see in the Santa Cruz Mountains right now is not indicative of potentially what it looked like 150 years ago. Aerial photos and historical photos show a landscape that was more heavily dominated by shrubs and grassland rather than mature trees. So cutting down a eucalyptus forest and replacing it with a native forest in some conditions is probably the appropriate move, but in other conditions, 150 years ago, there probably wasn't a forest there in the first place.
Yeah, I think even locally, we observe that with other parks where we have grasslands present. We're seeing succession of shrubland over time into grasslands. And so that's common to see in terms of, when there is a lack of natural disturbance, how these larger woody species over time will grow into spaces where they have the opportunity to, and you see that transition or that shift in habitat type occur over time. But maybe this is directed to Steve. In what ways do what you're talking about with going in with big machines and tearing up periodically? I'm not sure if you could clarify that, Amy. Do you want me to give you the mic for a second?
I think I have maybe a pretty good idea of what Amy's going after, and it's yeah, I saw your question, Amy, and I want you to know that that's something that we struggle with every time we do a project like this, and there are big decisions that have to be made, and we don't take them lightly. If for instance, you happen to be looking at the Huddart treatment area map and you take a look at the structure of the polygons in there, you can see that they're really woven. And so it starts with a kind of a pretty deep-seated GIS analysis, trying to get your best available data to figure out, okay, well, where are all the roads and infrastructure? Where are all the really important resources like the water courses, the unstable areas, other sensitive habitat types? And that starts creating polygons. And that's why the treatment areas are so meshed up with each other, and that they have little nooks and crannies, because essentially you lay out what you think is going to work, and then you go and you walk every single inch of all of that ground, and you walk the outskirts of all of those polygons and flag watercourse protections around, so that equipment knows not to go in there. And that field verification process has to sort of match up with your California Natural Diversity Database, where you're looking for known contacts of species, and you end up putting this all together to, well, create a level of ground that is operational and that can be done, but there are a whole set of conditions and criteria that go along with this analysis. So, and I think what the long term is that this area is reasonably operable with mechanized equipment. And it's likely that, I think one of the ways that I have sort of foresee this on other projects that I'm working on is that there'll be an understory clearing that happens in here. And it could be that some of the next steps that other properties are thinking about too is, well, maybe we do think about a mid-range diameter work on larger sudden oak death trees, right? As potentially a next stage. And that you could arrange these so that there are polygons that are kind of numbered, and that, in 5 years, maybe you retreat this one. And in another 5 years, maybe you retreat this one. But it's possible too that you could get to a point where you're like, you know what? We can start doing a little bit of pile and burning out here now. We have the understory cleared out enough, and we could start instituting some of that, or some broadcast burning. Or at the same time, you start looking at these polygons and where people live and where the systems are strong or where they're not strong. And maybe you start making some connections with handwork. But a big part of that guidance that goes along with it too, that it's a huge factor. I always try to make it the last factor, but it's a real one, is the cost. So the kind of work that we're proposing to do, can it be anywhere from the $2,000 to $4,000 acre treatment neighborhood, and to do that work by hand is almost 6 times as much. Sometimes, like, it could be up to $15,000 to $18,000 an acre. So all of those conditions and criteria sort of weigh in with your approach and how you modify it. And so I think the answer to your question is yes. There are other ways to do it, but in so many places we're so far behind that there's going to be some initial changes and what these systems look like. But I think you'll ultimately be impressed by the regenerative nature of these systems too. It's probably something I could talk about all day, Amy, because we think about it a lot when we're out there on the ground, and what are we really trying to do, and the systems that we're trying to protect and meet these middle of roads between the communities that we live in and the areas that we love so much and spend time in.
Steve made some fantastic points there, and just one that I'd like to hit on is that broadcast burning that he mentioned is kind of like the gold standard for fuel reduction, forest health, and things like that. And within the current kind of climate and ecosystem and wildland-urban interface we're dealing with, prescribed fire just is not feasible for most of the landscapes throughout this area. The density of fuels is too high. The depth of trained individuals and resources currently isn't up to what it should be, or up to what it needs to be to achieve it at the pace and scale that we need to. And we're operating in a climate with weather windows and relative humidity and wind and temperatures that leave the windows for achieving prescribed fires few and far between. And land managers throughout the area are preparing areas for prescribed fire and just can't hit the correct weather windows to actually put fire on the ground. So we do factor in other kind of methods and means of getting this work done. And currently mechanical mastication is the one that closely achieves our goals. at the scale that we need right now.
And if I could take Amy's next question too, is this question seems like it's a little bit more for staff, but it might be good to hear from an outsider on this one a little bit, who has spent time on a lot of different parks and a lot of different ownerships throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains. And I gotta say, when you go to Huddart and you go to Wunderlich and you look around, and I compare that with the amount of work in other places, not pointing in any realm, it's really good. So the history of the work that's happened over time, and I know that maybe sometimes you don't see people out there, but I definitely do. And foresters, you look at where these polygons are, and sometimes I come out in the middle of nowhere and I run into their staff. And I'm like, what are you guys doing out here? Like, oh, we're working on this part, this section, so they really do an amazing job of the work that they are doing. I mean, areas around Huddart they're kind of immaculate in some of the park areas. So I know sometimes it's hard to see or hard to feel, but on the scale of what kind of treatment San Mateo County Parks does, it's very high, in my opinion.
And just to piggyback on that, in the Western US and in California in general, we're just all kind of behind the curve in terms of forest management. And regionally, San Mateo County Parks is ahead of the curve.
Yeah, agreed.
Amy, I see a question below too about doing controlled burning occasionally. I think, David hit on that. It's just very difficult to be able to do effectively right now. Like you mentioned, the correct weather windows are very challenging. Having staff that are trained and able to do the work, we have, limits on that type of capacity as well. And so not to say that that isn't a tool in the toolbox that we wouldn't want to be able to utilize. It just, there are a lot of challenges and difficulties with being able to do it. I see a question about eucalyptus removal. And I feel like, there are a lot of considerations to take, like I mentioned, with doing full removal of a certain vegetation type and trying to convert to another. We have, like I mentioned, this project in Wunderlich, where this was done at a relatively small scale, and it was very costly, and there's a lot of time and effort needed to make that project a success. And so there are a lot of considerations to take into account when you are trying to plan a project that focuses on complete removal of a species or conversion of a forest type.
Yeah, I'll add to that the question about what treatment is for eucalyptus quarry park. I mean, that could be one method. There could be other ways to look at this. One thing we can share is that we are working to potentially develop a scope of work, like develop a proposal and a scope of work of what would be a suitable management strategy for Quarry Park. We're going to be working with all of our partners. RCD is going to be working with county parks, CAL FIRE, the community, to identify that. And so that's where we are on that. And it's not quite what we wanted to talk about today. We wanted to focus on our work for Huddart and Wunderlich, but that is something that I'm happy to share that that's another question that we're tackling with our partners here.
So I don't see any more questions, but I do want to just let all folks know that we do keep a frequently asked questions document updated when we do get certain questions asked in these forums. We like to keep a document of that, and we are, continuing to add to that. We have a copy of that frequently asked questions document posted to the park websites for these projects for Huddart and Wunderlich, if you find that through the county parks website. Again, I encourage you to find on those sites the links to be able to sign up for email notifications, which we can send out as we have more information to provide on park advisories or trail closures or progress for the project. And so really want to thank you all for being present at the webinar today. And we'll be sure to continue to post information. There'll be a recording of this webinar posted online as well if you know of anyone who might be interested in watching it. We're excited to see the benefits of this project. Yeah, with that, I would just like to adjourn the webinar, and thanks everyone for attending.